You didn't choose to exist, neither did I. We both just woke up one day to find ourselves in existence. Of course, it isn't just us. Everyone arrives the same way, none of us having chosen it. Existence happens to us. And it's not as if, once we exist, we are ushered towards the information desk where they tell us what it's all about, why we exist, why anything exists, the meaning of it all. Nope. That's on us to figure out. And after thousands of years of hurling our best minds at the question, we still don't know why we are here, or even if there is a reason we are here. I say we don't know why we are here. That is, of course, not to say that we don't know how. We have learned not only how each individual comes about via a certain intimate act, but also how the entire species came to be through the long process of evolution via natural selection. Still, though, the biological story of humanity tells us nothing about whether the processes by which life came about were set in motion for some reason, or whether the whole damn thing was merely a cosmic accident, an occurrence for no reason at all. We don't know, that is, whether life has some grand meaning, or whether it is, as it is put in Macbeth, a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Man is a mystery to man. We are mysteries to ourselves. We know not our own purpose. We know not our own story. We know not what we are. But of course, we can't just stop there. We can't just throw up our hands and declare the question beyond our capacity. At the very least, it seems that the only hunks of meat on earth capable of asking themselves about their own meaning should give it a serious go. Sure, maybe in the end, we can't answer such questions. Perhaps they really are just too big for us, too nebulous, too far beyond our intellectual horizons. But if that's the case, we should like to know why. If we cannot know, we at least want to know that we cannot know. We want to articulate the reasons we cannot know. If we cannot know, we should at least like to understand this strange fact about ourselves, that man is fundamentally mysterious to himself, and we should like to explore what that means. In other words, whatever we can know with respect to the meaning of life, we want to. Welcome to Gods Will Be Gods. I am Cameron Smith. This is the first in a series of episodes on the meaning of life. Yeah, I know. I wanted to start with something easy. The topic of this episode is cosmic meaning, a term employed in recent philosophical literature to refer to an objective reason for which life was brought into existence. A reason in the mind of a deity, as the theist would have it, or perhaps a reason in the mind of some grand consciousness of which we are somehow a part. We want to ask, is there a cosmic meaning? Was life brought into existence as part of some grand plan? But we must first ask about the stakes. Why does it matter? What are the stakes of meaning? Today, that's our question. Hope you enjoy. Think of the Copernican revolution, the correction of our astronomical model from geocentric to heliocentric. What was the significance of the fact that, actually, the Earth rotates around the sun and not the other way around? Why was that a revolution in the 16th and 17th centuries and not just a correction of our astronomical model? The answer is that the heliocentric model forced on us the fact that we are not the center of the universe, and it forced the question of whether, if we're not the center of the physical universe, then maybe we aren't the center of this story either. Think of Darwin's theory of evolution via natural selection. In the 19th century, after nearly 2,000 years of a narrative according to which we were the direct creations of God, the shepherds of the earth, bound for heaven, Darwin placed man back among the animals, informed us that actually we are another chink in an evolutionary chain that trails all the way back to the muck. From the muck man came, says Darwin. And so we found ourselves a little self-conscious about the point of existence. There was a creeping worry that if we, the shepherds of the earth, actually developed by the same processes as the ants and the pigs, perhaps our destiny, too, is no grander than theirs. We began to worry, as we do now, whether our most serious concerns are not just as insignificant as those of the ants on their hill. More than ever, we are lost at sea, unmoored from purpose, from meaning. What is it that we want from meaning, though? The answer isn't obvious. Perhaps it seems like we want our actions to matter in some cosmic way. Perhaps we think that in order for our actions to really matter, they must ring throughout eternity. Is it that we want some grand cosmic legacy to have our names written among the stars? But really? Have you ever had that thought? Have you ever, before starting some goal, had the thought that unless what I'm about to do will be regarded as significant in 300,000 years, let's say, it doesn't matter? I haven't. That seems, frankly, a little mad. I just don't know anyone who thinks like that. So what is it? Why do we even care if life is meaningful? What do we want from meaning? To my mind, Schopenhauer got it right. The 19th century German philosopher saw clearly the link between our hope for objective meaning and our need for the redemption of tragic suffering. Tragic suffering, and the terrible extent of it in this world, is what gives rise to the question of whether there is a point to it all. We survey existence and find it wanting. We find it problematic. As Leonard Cohen put it, there is a crack in things. We see death, decay, disease, the horrors of war, famine, cruelty, and betrayal, and our gut tells us, right or wrong, that such suffering cannot be for nothing, that such suffering would not exist if it were not for some grand purpose that justifies it, that redeems its victims. We think that if all of this suffering is for nothing, if the subjects of such suffering see no redemption, not even a chance at redemption, then existence is, in short, something that ought not be. Schopenhauer believed that there was no meaning to life, and he put it this way: life is a business that fails to cover its cost. What we want to know when we ask whether there is a meaning of life, to my mind, is whether life plays a role in some grand plan, some plan the goal of which redeems existence from tragedy. Whether or not we can get it, what we really want is that salvation. Our hope is that there is not only some point to all of this, but a point that makes sense of all the suffering, that explains it, that assures us that, after all, life is not as tragic as it seems. That is why the question of whether life has a meaning seems to us so significant. That is why our apparent inability to answer the question is so disheartening. Suffering reigns supreme on earth, and we would like to know if there is a point. And perhaps this is the main takeaway from this episode. As far as I can tell, the primary motivation behind our search for cosmic meaning is a desire for salvation, a desire for the redemption of tragedy. How else would we make sense of the fact that so many modern thinkers and artists, confronted with this prospect of a meaningless existence, seem to respond with despair? How else do we make sense of all the angst of the 20th century, all the fist pumping at the sky, the prostrations before the prospect of absurdity? Yes, of course, there were the wars, but it was the grand display of suffering in those wars that made them so awful. Was it not the thought that the world be damned if all of this suffering is for nothing? Here's Nietzsche from the third essay of the Genealogy of Morality. Man, he says, the bravest of animals and the one most accustomed to suffering, does not repudiate suffering as such. He desires it. He even seeks it out, provided he is shown a meaning for it, a purpose of suffering. The meaninglessness of suffering, he says, not suffering itself, was the curse that lay over mankind so far. It's an important point, lest we be confused with those who would condemn suffering totally. What lofty goal, after all, has been achieved with no suffering at all? Often, as Nietzsche points out, we even take up voluntary suffering. I used to run up mountains. It wasn't easy. I wanted desperately to have the fastest time on one of the highest peaks in the Great Smoky Mountains. It was difficult. I fell hard and I fell fast and I fell often. We do invite suffering, provided, as Nietzsche says, that there is a point. But meaningless suffering, unredeemed suffering, That is what prompts gloom, what prompts despair, what invites the damning pessimism about existence that we see in Schopenhauer. That is the curse that lay over mankind. Consider the following passage from Jack Kerouac in his Desolation Angels. He says, "Who are men that they can insult men? Who are these people who wear pants and dresses and sneer? What am I talking about? I'm talking about human helplessness and unbelievable loneliness in the darkness of birth and death, and asking, what is there to laugh about in that? How can you be clever in a meat grinder? Who makes fun of misery? There's my mother, a hunk of flesh that didn't ask to be born, sleeping restlessly, dreaming hopefully, beside her son who didn't ask to be born, thinking desperately, praying hopelessly, in a bouncing earthly vehicle going from nowhere to nowhere. Where is the rock that will sustain us? Why are we here?" Perhaps Schopenhauer puts it best. If you try to imagine, as nearly as you can, what an amount of misery, pain, and suffering of every kind the sun shines upon in its course, you will admit that it would be much better if, on the earth as little as on the moon, the sun were able to call forth the phenomena of life, and if, here as there, the surface were still in a crystalline state. Elsewhere, he puts it this way: if we were to conduct the most hardened and calloused optimist through hospitals, infirmaries, operating theaters, through prisons, torture chambers, and slave hotels, over battlefields and to places of execution, if we were to open to him all the dark abodes of misery where it shuns the gaze of cold curiosity, and finally were to allow him to glance into the dungeon of Ugolino where prisoners starve to death, he too would certainly see in the end what kind of a world is this best of all possible worlds. He's obviously making fun of the idea that this is the best of all possible worlds. The despair in all of these lines makes no sense at all if we presume that our concern with the meaning of life is just about being a part of some grand cosmic scheme, is just about hoping that life matters in some absurdly cosmic way, as if we cared whether the most minute of our actions echo through eternity on a cosmic scale. It's not about mattering to the universe. It's not about scrolling our name across the sky. What we care about is the redemption of tragedy. Or at least I think that that's true. What we care about is whether our suffering has a point. Nietzsche saw all of this coming. He was able to see over his own century, to see the consequences of the Copernican revolution, of the Darwinian revolution, of the Enlightenment generally. He saw belief in God, hitherto our source and foundation of normativity, collapse under the weight of the new scientific discoveries. He worried that this, the death of God, as he calls it, would result in a culture of nihilism. He thought that the death of God would usher in one of the most dangerous times in human history, one in which we are unsure of ourselves, unsure of our role in the universe, and a little self-conscious that that role might not amount to much. He worried that all of this would usher in a culture of nihilism, a culture that believes in nothing, has no aspirations, thinks of nothing but its own comfort and entertainment, a culture with which humanity could die out with no more fight than a whimper and an indifferent blink. Consider the following passage from The Joyful Science. It's called The Madman. You might have heard it before. He writes, "Have you not heard of that madman who lit the lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace, and cried incessantly, 'I seek God, I seek God'? As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. 'Has he got lost?' asked one. 'Did he lose his way like a child?' asked another. Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. 'Whither is God?' he cried. 'I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually? Backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as though through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of gravediggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine composition? Gods too decompose. God is dead, he says. God remains dead, and we have killed him. Nietzsche's not celebrating the collapse of Christianity here. He does do that, make no mistake about it. But here he worries about it. The madman runs into the town square. I see God, he says, and he is met with mockery, with scorn. What's it matter anyway, they seem to say. And so too would many of our contemporary atheists react the same way. But the Christian God was for nearly 2,000 years the theoretical foundation of Western morality, our morality, also the foundation of our conception of a meaningful life. There was a time, let's say, in the 14th century, when a Christian peasant looked out into the night sky and he knew, or felt he knew, exactly his own destiny. It was, after all, up to him. Follow Christ, and he would have heaven. The Christian story provided us with exactly the sort of grand narrative I mentioned earlier. Every individual has a role to play in God's grand plan, and the reward? Salvation. The redemption of suffering on earth. So if God is dead, well then, says Nietzsche, has not the rug been pulled from beneath their feet? I really do think that ours is a spiritual problem, a crisis of meaning. And if we don't get it right, if we blithely accept an absurd existence, if we shrug our shoulders at the prospect that nothing on earth is any more significant than the movement of dust, we are likely to wind up a vacuous, spiritually indifferent, lethargic society lacking entirely in aspirations, or at least in any noble aspirations. There is a bit of fatalism in Nietzsche. In the end, he thinks anyway, whether an individual collapses into despair at the prospect of an absurd existence or affirms it is a matter of physiological strength. Some, the weak, the sickly, to use Nietzsche's own language, some will despair existence because they must. Incapable of digesting their own suffering, some, like Schopenhauer, will scrawl their misery onto the world and declare a universal pessimism. If the life deniers, as Nietzsche calls them, if they were capable of digesting suffering and moving on, they could face the world as it is and still maintain vigor enough for lofty aspirations in art and culture and politics, war. He hopes that such people exist, for it's only they, he thinks, that can spare humanity from nihilism. Of course, it's worth saying that Nietzsche may well be wrong about all of that. I mention him here because I know that all of this talk of our need for salvation, of our need for the redemption of existence, all this black, bilious despair of life may well leave you feeling a little green around the gills. And to be honest, it makes even me a bit nauseous. Perhaps we ought to take Nietzsche's advice and treat pessimism like an ice bath, quickly in, quickly out. But in fact, I find myself stretched thin between Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, between life denial and affirmation. However my final evaluation of life ends up, though, I want it to be based on a real confrontation with reality, insofar as that's possible. If the question is life a good thing? Well then, I want to know what life is. And Schopenhauer is correct that life is overrun with things dying and things dead, with suffering. In fact, life is so often bad for so many living things that it does raise the question of its own value. Is life on the whole worthy of its own cost? Is there a point to it all? I don't know the answer, but to be candid, I do often doubt that anything but divine salvation could possibly render the story of life a net good. Nietzsche speaks often of greatness, but to be candid, I find it difficult to conceive of humanity doing anything so great as to cover the misery of millennia. But then again, perhaps I'm sick. I do relish life, though. I always have. the rich mystery of the unknown narrative, the terrible puzzle of man, the high stakes of courage, cowardice, of love and hate, the adventures of the spirit and thought and creativity, the sublimity of nature. I love it all. Despite the world's suffering, in fact. I wake up in the early morning and sing praises to a new dawn, not every day, but often. I love it all so much, in fact, that even as I find myself drawn to pessimism as a realistic assessment, disparaging such a sublime existence really does leave me green. Do you hear that? That's me blowing in the wind. So these things go. I didn't answer the question of whether there's a cosmic meaning. We'll get to that, or at least to the attempt. But I hope I have outlined the stakes. We ask, is life meaningful? What's the value of life? And we take those questions seriously. We want to know if life is a good thing, worthy of our awe and praise and admiration and the whole hullabaloo of the human race. We want to know if there is redemption for tragedy, salvation for all who suffer at the hands of time, or whether reality is simply tragic. All right, guys. The entire transcript of this, if you prefer reading it or revisiting something, is on my website. Everything is free. Thanks for listening. Until next time.